So you're in a narcissistic relationship, okay? Let's start there. And in the relationship, you find yourself doing things that you wouldn't usually do or wouldn't prefer to do, or you find yourself not bringing up things that matter to you, or that things that are a problem that you usually would have addressed or brought up in another relationship or with another person. You may find that in this relationship you turn down invitations you would typically go to. You may slowly start changing things about yourself, maybe about how you dress or how you spend money. Does any of that sound familiar? In some cases, you may be living under conditions of pretty intense coercive control. And you have been told in so many words that you cannot do these things. But in most cases, you're not told in as many words you can't do these things. In most cases, the discomfort is that you were never really told you can't do them. And if you say you were literally asked, did they tell you not to say that? Did they tell you that you couldn't have your friends over? Well, your answer would be, well, no. But they make everyone who we invite so uncomfortable. It's embarrassing when I have people over. It's an all-out war if I ask about anything or give them any feedback. So no, they don't ask, but I know the score. In these relationships, you feel as though you're controlled without them ever making a demand. And once you're in it, it can feel awful because you will have gaslighted argument after gaslighted argument where they say, I never said you couldn't do those things. And sadly, they probably never did tell you you can't do those things. But it's sort of unfair because if you did do the thing that they didn't actually ask you to not do, then everything would escalate, right? But they don't cop to that because actually they didn't say it. And they just tell you that you make that stuff up. Are you following me so far? It's a little confusing. And if you're going through this, I know you're following me because you've been through that. You don't do the thing, they never told you not to do it, but you know you can't do it. In a narcissistic relationship, you lose your freedom. It really is that simple. You lose the freedom to say what you want, to do what you need, to ask for what you need, to be who you are, to share beliefs that you have, and that can even extend to basic human functions like eating what you want, eating when you want, wearing what you want, going to sleep when you want. It can also be about losing the freedoms to maintain friendships that you want. You lose your freedom to be a separate human being. That means if you were born to a narcissistic parent or parents, you never had any freedoms. You existed as them, for them, by them. And as you got older and you were starting the natural process of individuation, then that process would be thwarted and the manipulation would begin, with the conversation basically being that you owe them. It's powerful and guilt-inducing stuff for a kid who often is beholden to their parents for a very long time before they can at all realistically be independent. But in adult relationships, when you meet someone, you, in most cases, I think you believe you're a free human being with choices and a separate sense of self. And you meet this person and they aren't an ogre. This isn't a person who's literally keeping you under lock and key like some terrifying fairy tale. You might find that there's some fun times in the relationship, especially in the beginning. They may have made you feel special. You think to yourself, okay, this whole coercive control thing, that's what happens in those severe relationships. This stuff in my relationship, like, that's not this. I can come and go as I want. We have enough decent days. This isn't a loss of freedom. I mean, coercion feels like a heavy word. But is it? In essence, a narcissistic or antagonistic person can control you, and they don't have to say a word. And it's really a hell of a trick. It's really part of the larger spectrum of coercion. To coerce someone is to compel someone to do something that they may not be consenting to do or want to do. And this happens through fear, force, or domination. Coercion can involve offering someone something that they need or couldn't get otherwise. For example, money. But you're offering them enough, so much money, that they can't say no because of the difference that amount of money would make. And so what happens is that in the coercive relationship, the person being coerced feels as though they were in some way part of the problem, that they bear some of the so-called blame or responsibility for their loss of freedom. They'll say things like, I never said no, I never tried to walk away, I did take the things they offered, I didn't say anything, I didn't bring up my concerns. But, all of that has to be weighed against the alternative, which would be the fear or the ramifications of saying something or doing something. The big mistake we make when we talk about the experiences that people have in narcissistic relationships is that we keep talking about choice, choice, choice. When you have these sort of narcissistic behaviors and coercion as part of the relationship picture, it's really no longer about voluntary choices. Everything you're doing is often about the avoidance of fear. And that is a different issue. Choice is based on some level of freedom and safety. Coercion is about relenting to something because you really don't have options. So telling someone that they do have the choice of losing custody of their kids or not having a place to stay or the threat of violence or even having to endure the silent treatment for the week is a choice. This other option is harmful and doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like something to avoid, right? So these aren't choices. They're like, which of these is the least awful? Coercion works on the basis of fear. Now, obviously, in more severe cases of it, the fears are pretty clear that if you don't do what the person says or demands, that there will be a threat of violence, or maybe a threat of loss of safety, like a loss of shelter or a loss of money, or maybe a threat that they will harm your children or your pets. So that threat feels more clear. But that's not what happens in most narcissistic relationships. In most narcissistic relationships, the fears are not so much in your face. And in fact, you can do that right now in your narcissistic relationship. For example, when you do things like hold back on you don't exert your you-ness. You don't say what you want to say or do anything that you need to do or express, or you don't engage in things that matter to you, or you don't spend time in ways that are important to you, or you don't spend time with people you value. And the narcissistic person or people didn't ask you to do that in so many words. But the idea that you can't do those things is sort of there and it's implicit. You have to ask yourself, what is the fear for you if you were to do those things? In most cases, it's the fear of a fight. Sometimes it's a fear of abandonment. It's a fear of an entire day lost to arguments, or the discomfort of the silent treatment. It is the fear of them telling people bad things about you. It's the fear of their rage. It's the fear of ruining your children's days, weeks, or months. It's the fear of one more confusing argument. It's the fear of being viewed as bad. And there's also a much deeper fear. The entire narcissistic relationship is sort of based on a fiction. We tell ourselves we love them, or this is my family. But as we know from betrayal blindness, the cost of seeing what's happening in these relationships is too high. And it's all ingrained in the trauma-bonded system. It's that sort of knowing that if we do make ourselves known, if we be ourselves, if we say and ask for what we need, that their true nature will then really be shown, and we will then really have to question this relationship or family or our place in a world. So not saying something allows the status quo to sustain. And while this is not a conscious choice on our part, I won't say anything so I can keep this messed up relationship going. We're not doing that consciously. It is its own form of coercion. And this loss of freedom and chronic coercion is what the narcissistic relationship is about. When love meets coercion, that's what we call the trauma bond. We really don't have choices. But even well-intended people in our lives might imply that we do. It's why so many survivors are asked or told, well, if it was so miserable, why didn't you just leave? And why, when the general public that may not have fully experienced one of these emotionally abusive relationships hears that someone was stuck in one of these relationships and felt confused and that they didn't have a choice, we tend to shame and blame the person who didn't leave and say to them, well, you did have a choice, but you took the easy path and stayed. Or, heaven forbid, you benefited in some superficial way from the relationship. You might be told things like, well, you did live in the nice house, or you did get to take those nice vacations. Then the blame and the questioning is all leveled at the person who experienced the coercion, because the narcissistic person actually never came out and said in as many words, you can't do these things. Instead, all of it was implied, but that implication was powerful. And for this reason, it is so hard for survivors to get support, sometimes even from the field of mental health. It doesn't matter how rich, how powerful, whether you have a big job. These unspoken but clearly present coercive dynamics are so powerful. For example, you meet someone, it's everything you have ever wanted, something shifts in you, you do fall in love, and that is real to you, at least. So when what initially feel like small things that you stop doing or do differently because they're better for the other person, you start making those shifts. Maybe you stop seeing that friend you like as often. Maybe you don't bring up that topic of conversation. These are slow changes. And at the same time, all that good stuff is still happening. But you sense how quickly cold things can get when you be you. And little by little, feather by feather, you take your wings off. And frankly, it's never enough. Ultimately, it all just becomes a power play that they can exert. But then one day, you're just relenting to the coercion without even thinking about it. Sadly, our sort of giving in becomes encoded and ingrained and reflexive, and then we feel like we're lost. And we blame ourselves for that too. We blame ourselves for getting lost, for losing ourselves, and for letting people down. But then we do recognize that our so-called capitulation, our giving in or giving up on our freedoms, was generally never directly asked for. It was implied, which then leads to more criticism. We're told, well, that's a you thing. And the gaslighting digs the hole deeper. Let's say you bring up a sacrifice you made. For example, a Saturday night when they said they would go out to dinner. So you cancel with your friends. And you don't tell the narcissistic person you canceled with your friends. You just know that you couldn't even bring it up. And then they decide at the last minute that actually they don't want to go out for dinner. So then if you were to bring up that you canceled on your friends and you're disappointed that they're making this last minute shift, then they can tell you, hey, I never told you to cancel on your friends. And that's what's so frustrating, because they're right, they didn't. That's when these arguments get messy. Because in a lot of narcissistic relationships, all the arguments can feel like they're just based on these little facts. I never said that. And you say clearly, anytime I say I'm going out with my friends, you act like a victim or you say terrible things about them. But then the conversation shifts and becomes about how you're difficult and demanding and mean. And then maybe you have to endure the silent treatment for a while. This coercion and control in these relationships is typically unspoken, and that's why it's so powerful. Because it works because we believe we're complicit in what's happening. But all you are doing is trying to maintain a connection, as well as avoid conflict, but maintain a connection to something that you did or perhaps do love. You are an object, though. You're a convenience, and you're something to control to them. They may be a person you love and care about, and they believe that they love you. It doesn't work, but it's a hall of mirrors, but the hall of mirrors is filled with distorted mirrors. And again, it's why people can't always easily get help when they're in these relationships. Because you do realize that they never in so many words told you to basically be silent and shut yourself down. And they would call you dramatic if you said that is how you feel in the relationship. And then people start calling you a codependent or a people pleaser or neurotic. No, this sort of insidious coercion of using fear and manipulation is the core of the narcissistic relationship, of cultic systems, of narcissistic family systems. In the name of connection, we figure out how to maintain these relationships in a way that is more conflict-free, to maintain the illusion or image that we have of this person, and above all, to remain psychologically safe. But by the time it's done, we look at ourselves as our own persecutors and abusers, and we say to ourselves, I'm responsible, I'm the one who stayed, they never told me to not do this or say this, my cowardice, my fear kept me stuck, that's on me. That right there, though, is the anthem of every survivor. You take all the responsibility, and then the narcissistic person doesn't need to take any. The narcissistic person actually never needs to say the things. It happens because we want to make it work. And so it feels like we're trying to construct a case to convince ourselves of what happened in the relationship without evidence. It's why these cases are sort of difficult, if you will, to prosecute, to adequately bring up in family court, and simply to understand clearly for ourselves. I'm sorry to sound like a broken record, but it's not you. Coercion steals freedom. But at the same time, when we are told we have freedom by other people, it can feel like the ultimate gaslight. And this cycle happens in every narcissistic relationship to a greater or lesser degree. Sometimes the greatest harms of the narcissistic relationships are the words that are never said. Thanks again.